Okay, good morning, everyone. It's right now 5:07 in the morning here in Singapore on the other side of the world. And today I'm honored to be able to give a short presentation on the history of Singapore in a nutshell. Um, so without further delay, I'm just going to go into what I've prepared for this session. It's not meant to be a very comprehensive coverage of what Singapore has gone through in the last 57 years as a country, but it's designed in a way to just give everyone a snapshot of what Singapore has progressed through in slightly over half a century of existence. Yeah. So essentially, I've broken up my presentation today on these 4 points. First, the first two being whether Singapore was a country by accident or destiny, its time as an Asian tiger, a period of rapid economic growth. Then for the second half, I'll be looking a bit at Singapore's education system and what are some of the challenges ahead that I can foresee. And this is coming to you as an educator who has been in the service for 25 years. I started my teaching in Singapore in 1998, and over the years, I've seen how the system has evolved, and looking ahead, we also see what are some of the challenges and what are some of the directions that Singapore is going to be taking with regards to revamps to its educational system. So, was Singapore a country by accident or by destiny, or rather, is Singapore's success an accident or part of its destiny? From the time that I was a child in school, the official narrative has always been of Singapore being just a jungle-filled island that just happened to be stumbled upon by this British official that was sailing past the region, and then he saw the island and said, you know, that looks like a great place for us to set up a settlement, and it looks like it's going to be a good place for passing ships to stop by. We could make it into a thriving port, and that was how the history of Singapore's founding was initially positioned back in the 1980s, when this was being taught, and that was just about 15 years after Singapore became independent as a country. But over the course of the years, we have new historical evidence has evolved to challenge this traditional view. So the official story is that in 1819, the British established a colony officially at the southern tip of Malaya, which is present-day Malaysia, allowing the British government the means to counter the influence of the Dutch in the region. Now, if you understand the history of Southeast Asia, which Singapore is right in the smack center of it, is that it was a spice-growing region. At the height of colonial expansion, the colonial powers, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and the English were all interested in the territories in the region. The Portuguese were actually the first ones to arrive. They arrived in the Spice Islands and they managed to set up little settlements, which till today, these places still bear the mark of their colonization. Then this was followed later on by the Dutch who came, and the Dutch also set up settlements. And the British were very keen to get a share of this very lucrative trade that was going on in the region. So as you can see from this map of the region from the 1800s, you would see that in the yellow regions, that's Indochina today, which is Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. And you see this green region here, that's Malaya, which is present-day Malaysia. And Singapore is right there at the smack there at the bottom. You see 3 red arrows that I've put on the map. The topmost is actually pointing at the first British settlement that was set up in the region, which is the island port of Penang. Right, this was actually set up towards the end of the 18th century by Sir Francis Light. He arrived, he said, well, this island looks like a good place for us to have a port. It sits right at the entrance to the Straits of Malacca, which is actually an important maritime trade route even till today. ships sail through this region because it's a narrow 2 kilometer wide waterway that sits between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Malaysian mainland. And because of the fact that it's a waterway between two land masses, it's sheltered from storms. So since time immemorial, ships have always taken advantage of this waterway and they've sailed through it. So the British saw that Penang was actually a good location. They set up a port there. But as time passed, they realized, well, it's a bit located far too north of the Straits of Malacca, and they couldn't quite make full use of it because ships would travel down the Straits of Malacca, then make a turn around Singapore, and then upwards north towards China. And that was the valuable maritime Silk Route, which for hundreds of years, Arab traders would have taken this route to bring goods from China down to Southeast Asia, get some spices, and then from there they will cross the Indian Ocean all the way to India, and then from India to the Gulf of Aden in what is present day the Middle East, and then even the historical evidence would support trade that went all the way to places like Mozambique, Kenya in present day Africa. So there was a lot of that trade that was going through this region. And so the British were just coming on the end of that time period, and then they were interested in tapping into this trade route. And so they even had another port, which is the bottommost red arrow, and that's the island of, or rather the port city of Bencoolen, which the British held on to. So they were trying to find another place that was more strategically located. And finally, Raffles was just sailing past the area. Then he realized, hey, wait, there's an island, right here where the second arrow is, that is, covered in jungle. It doesn't seem to be inhabited. Let's try and see whether there's anyone that owns it, and let's try and set up a port there, which was exactly what he did. He arrived on the island, found a few villagers, asked around, like who owns this place. He managed to find out from the local headman that it was actually part of the Johor Sultanate, Johor being the southernmost state of present-day Malaysia. It has a royal family that stretches all the way back hundreds of years to that is connected to the last dynasty of the Malacca Sultanate. And so he sort of like took advantage of a family feud. The previous Sultan had died without a successor, so there was this succession dispute that was going on. So he managed to back one of the parties, gave a sum of money and said, we want you to sign this piece of paper. We'll give you and your family some gold every month or in a year. And then we're going to just take use of this place, and then we're going to set up a port here. So that's how the story originally went. So this basically gave the British valuable access to the shipping that was traveling through the region. And Singapore was very strategically placed for ships to stop at. And this also gave them to access for other traders that came in from the rest of the region. You could see on the middle of the map, you would see Borneo, you would see Java Island, and then you have the Spice Islands right in the middle. And that's where pepper, nutmeg, stuff like that was all grown. And it was a great place for the British to actually set up a free port where traders from the region could also come and trade their goods, and the British gained by taxing some of it. And this didn't go down very well with the Dutch, right? The most pivotal impact that this British settlement had was the fact that it annoyed the Dutch so much that in the end, the British and the Dutch actually sat down and they signed an agreement in 1824 called the Anglo-Dutch Treaty that basically divided the whole Southeast Asia into two zones of influence. So the Dutch and the British said, okay, in order for us not to have conflict with each other with this kind of expansion on either side, what will happen is that the British will restrict themselves to influence to Malaysia and what's north of Malaysia. So they drew a line straight through the Straits of Malacca, bent it around Singapore, and then went straight up towards the South China Sea. So that left what is present day, all of present day Indonesia in within the Dutch sphere of control. The British never set foot in that region anymore. They even traded the island of or rather the port of Bencoolen, which I mentioned, with the Dutch port of Malacca, which they control. So this effectively gave the British control over all of Malaysia, and then the rest of Indonesia was just left to the Dutch to colonize and control. And that basically has determined the fate, or rather the histories of the countries in Southeast Asia till today. So even though Indonesia is very close to Malaysia, very close to Singapore, because of that colonial past, the histories of the two regions have evolved very differently, to the point that it has impacted the languages used by the peoples of these two places. If you have traveled in the region, you will realize that both Malaysians and Indonesians actually speak Malay, but the Malay has been colored by different linguistic influences from English and from Dutch. How Indonesians would speak, they would use certain terms that are borrowed from Dutch versus how Malaysians speak Malay. The words that they would use for different terms would be very different because of the fact that the English have helped to establish the alphabet for the written Malay language in Malaysia, whereas the written language in Indonesia for Malay is actually influenced by Dutch. So just a simple example is in Malaysia, the word for car would be kereta, whereas in Indonesia, the word they will use is mobil, which is taken from Dutch. So it's very interesting to see how different countries in the region, due to the colonial past, have taken on different kinds of characteristics because of it. And if you look at a map towards the center where the Philippines are, that has been under Spanish influence, and later on American influence after the American-Spanish War. Yeah. So moving on. So historical evidence has actually come forward to show us that actually that challenges this view that the British happened to find a place that everyone overlooked. About 15 years ago, this book was published. It was called 700 Years of History, that pushes back the history of Singapore all the way down to the 13th century. This was based a lot on historical written records, the Malay annals, which are a collection of stories about the region, and also from archaeological evidence that was unearthed. They discovered that actually Singapore was already a trading port before the British arrived. It wasn't just a jungle-filled area that nobody had ever heard of, etc. But instead, it was actually a thriving port before that. Unfortunately, at that time when Raffles arrived, it had already fallen into disrepair because of the fact that it was destroyed by attack by Javanese forces about 100 years prior. So it was actually in a period of neglect, and people had forgotten about that thriving port that was there when the British arrived. So when the British arrived on the shores of Singapore, they thought that this place is it's a jungle field, etc. But it's because the thriving town that had been there had been destroyed in an attack. And before that, for hundreds of years, it was actually a thriving port known as Temasek, which is a sea town. Now, these names like Temasek and then later on Singapore, these are names that are the historical names of Singapore. And Temasek actually is used quite often in Singapore in some of the names of schools. Singapore Sovereign Fund is actually called the Temasek Corporation, which holds billions of dollars in assets. And these names continue to live on in certain place names in Singapore and in the names of companies, etc. Right? So this shows us that Singapore was actually not something that was the product of a British discovery, but actually something that existed way before that. And this is currently one of the key textbooks that is used in our secondary schools to teach our students the history of Singapore, that puts the history of Singapore further back than the colonial part, which was in the 1980s. When I was learning this, it was always this, this place was nothing. It was the British that actually discovered it and then made it into something. And this view has been challenged, and it has been refuted by the evidence that's come up. And we realize that there is a lot of local history that happened. So one of the iconic histories taken from the Malay Annals that I mentioned, which is about a collection of historical tales about region that actually tells us about how Singapore got its name. Why is it called Singapore today? And this page that you see here is actually one of the comic strips that we put into the textbook that you see at the bottom right-hand corner. Was our social studies textbook for primary 4 children, which are about 10-year-olds. This was actually written by my team and I. Well, I was part of the team that actually designed this resource that was used across all schools in the nation. And this comic that you see here is actually the one that tells the story of Prince Sanglila Utama, an Indonesian prince from Palembang, and how he actually discovered Singapore. And how he actually was the one that gave Singapore the name Singapura. So the story goes is that the prince was one day on the Indonesian side. He was looking for a place to settle and create a settlement with his followers, because he himself was fleeing from a defeat at the hands of a more powerful empire. So I suppose he was probably on one of the Indonesian islands, like for example, Batam or Bintang, and he was looking for a place to bring his followers when he was pointing across the oceans and he saw some gleaming white sand, right? So he pointed to his followers and said, look, there's light reflecting off a gleaming beach. There seems to be a suitable island over there. Let's go over there and let's explore whether this place is suitable. So the story goes is that he brought his followers across the sea, arrived in Singapore, and then when he arrives on the island, a great beast burst out of the undergrowth. And so when the beast stormed past them, he asked his followers, what beast was that? So someone said, it's probably a singer, which is actually I think it's a Sanskrit name for a lion. So if you and the evidence here is that in India today, you know, someone who's a sing is a lion. So the word sing basically sing or singer represents a lion. So he said, this is an auspicious sign. Let's name this place Singapura. Pura means city, so Lion City. So that has somehow stuck on until today. Singapore calls itself the Lion City. We use a symbol of a lion. It's on our national crest. It's one of our national symbols. We call ourselves the Lion City. Our national aero acrobatics group is called the Red Lions. So it's something that's used a lot in the imagery of Singapore and describing Singapore. But the interesting part is that if you are a person who studied about animals, there are no lions in this part of the world. Lions don't exist. This is not part of any territory of lions. Singapore was actually what the largest cat you would have in the region is actually a tiger. It wouldn't be a lion. So it's very interesting how this whole story of how Singapore got its name came from. But yeah, at the same time, the geography and the biology, the flora and fauna of the region doesn't support the idea of had there ever been lions in this region, right? But anyway, that stuck, and then that's how Singapore got its name. It became Singapura. So historical evidence has actually shown us that Singapore was actually a place fallen on hard times. It had already been an important port. It wasn't just an accidental discovery. The geography of Singapore is unique, and it plays a huge role in the development of Singapore. Until today, Singapore is still an important maritime port, despite the fact that it's no longer the key driving economic activity on the island. But Singapore is very strategically placed. Ships can't help but stop at Singapore because it's just right there, smack in the center. After you sail down from China's ports, this is basically the next port of call that it's very convenient to stop at. And then from there, turn north, head up the Straits of Malacca and into the Indian Ocean, right? So now today we know that history didn't come with the British, it had come long before. The archaeological evidence supports that view. And also to the point that, you know, we in Singapore, we have named so much after Sir Stamford Raffles. We have sort of like held him up as such an idol. You know, our top education institution is called Raffles Institution. We've got places in Singapore like Raffles Square, Raffles Place. We've got schools that are called like Stanford, which are named after him. And then only to discover later on that the history supports the idea that most of the work actually wasn't done by Raffles himself. He came, he left his name, and then he ran off gallivanting elsewhere, left his lieutenant in charge, Mr. William Farquhar, to run the whole town, develop the place, and then, basically took all the credit for it. So in today, so many of my students who are studying this now in the secondary schools, they suddenly realize, okay, this guy that we've been holding up as the kind of idol actually wasn't that great a guy. Yeah, and I think some of that revisionist history is coming in. In the past, first Stanford Raffles statue would be sitting on the banks of the Singapore River to mark the spot where he landed. But today we have several other statues in the region, in that same area, to mark this revisionist view. We have Sanglila Utama statue there as well. I think so far we don't have a very strong push to put Mr. William Farquhar up as an idol for Singaporeans to learn about, but there's greater recognition that he was the one that contributed to the development of Singapore. So with that, I bring myself to the end of my first session. I want to go now into Singapore's rapid development as an industrialized country. And after this, we'll just have a short Q&A if any of you have. So let's fast forward. That's Singapore's history basically during that period was just a lot of economic development from a small port. The British ran it well. People started to come into the region. All right. So the history of modern Singapore as a nation actually started in 1963, right? By the time we reach World War II in the 1940s, Singapore was already a part of the massive British Empire, its chain of ports. It fell to the Japanese who invaded the region in the 1940s. They came down through Thailand. They swept through British defenses. They conquered all of Malaya. They took out Singapore, which was the last bastion of British control in Southeast Asia. And then essentially, it was a horrific period of time for the people living in the area. Till today, I mean, my own father was a survivor of this period. He was actually born just 4 years, sorry, before the Japanese occupation of Singapore. That generation that lived through it as teens has actually passed on. There aren't many people around who still remember firsthand what happened, but you do have people who were born during that period or slightly before that period who are now all in their late 80s. There aren't many, but there are some oral records that we have managed to capture, and these are freely available online for consumption if you try to look for them. Right, and then after the Japanese occupation, the end of World War II, the British came back in 1948, and that's where this movement for the independence of Singapore occurred. And the British basically were very keen to let go of the region to withdraw, and that was actually what they did with Malaysia. But the things that Singapore was actually left out of the plan. And then Singapore actually agitated for independence in 1963 by saying, okay, let's join Malaysia, and give us independence. So there was a plebiscite, and then in 16 September 1963, Singapore actually became independent. So this is actually the real independence of Singapore from the British. But of course, today Singapore marks its own independence on the 9th of August in 1965, rather than this date, 16 September 1963. So I'll just give you a short summary. So from 1819 onwards, after the British opened up the port, there was massive immigration, basically because you would find in Malaya, where the British also took control, they found huge tin deposits. They wanted to mine this resource. They didn't have the manpower to do it. They weren't interested in getting the locals to do it. So this attracted massive Chinese immigration from the southern Chinese provinces. People came here by the thousands. They worked in the mines, and the the demographics of the region. If you look at Malaysia today, Malaysia has a very sizable Chinese population. Basically, these are the descendants of the Chinese who came and worked in the mines, um, and in the ports that the British set up. And even the linguistic distribution of the Chinese immigrants in Malaysia reflects that kind of history. So if you go to places like Kuala Lumpur, which is the capital of Malaysia, the northern part of Malaysia, a lot of Chinese actually speak Cantonese because they come from the southern province of Canton. They came to work in the mines. But if you come to places like Singapore or Malacca or Penang, people are mainly Hokkien speakers. They come from the province of Fujian in China. They largely worked in the ports and in the urban areas, so they don't speak Cantonese. They were dock workers. So these reflect the kind of migration patterns that happened as a result of the British colonization of Malaysia, of then Malaya, right? So all this production was happening in Malaya. The British actually built a railroad network that shipped all these goods down to the southern end, which is Singapore, and then from Singapore's ports, these reached the rest of the British Empire, onto Australia and even New Zealand, right? So Singapore is actually a stopping point for ships going to Australia, British possessions in Australia, and then New Zealand as well. And even today, if you were to fly from Australia to the UK, you would stop by Singapore. So Singapore is actually sort of mirrored that same role as a connecting point in terms of the aerospace industry as well. And Singapore is the air hub for all aircraft coming into the region and on transit from Australia to New Zealand, Australia to Europe. So Australians and New Zealanders who fly through, who want to fly to Europe would necessarily stop by Singapore. And its strategic position was important to British in terms of trade and military defense, making Singapore important military point for the British defense of the region. So you can see here a map of Singapore, circular 1905. This is the whole of Singapore Island, and the area that I've circled was actually the only developed area in the region. And this is where, on the whole island itself, and this is where the British actually did their development of Singapore. This is where Singapore town is. And when you get here, this is actually the downtown area. You will see traces of the British development of Singapore itself, and this is Singapore's main waterfront, which is today Singapore's main commercial financial district. And on the right here, you will see a detailed map of how much the British developed. You are going to be going to Arab Street. Arab Street is part of the area that the British developed. And the reason why these names have names like Arab Street, you have places like Chinatown, Little India, was basically because of this town plan that the British developed, where they segregated the different ethnic groups and assigned them areas to live in. So Arab Street was actually a place where a lot of Arab traders were assigned a place for them to build houses and live in. And then this was kind of racially segregated development of Singapore town, and giving different ethnic groups different parts of the city to live in, which was not uncommon back then. You will find that even in US cities like San Francisco, you would have a Chinatown where you have an area where most Chinese immigrants would settle in. Yeah. So after 1948, after the Second World War, the British were back, but they were in this process of letting go. They were letting go of the possessions in Africa, in India. In India itself, of course, you have the Indians wanting independence. Mahatma Gandhi was leading the independence movement, agitating for independence for India, right? In Palestine, in Tanzania, Kenya, all these things were happening. And the British were very well aware that after World War II, they were not in a position to continue to hold on to these places. They were not going to fight the locals over it. They could also see these same developments in parts of Indonesia. The Dutch were actually fighting the Indonesians. The Indonesians had taken up arms. They were actually fighting the Dutch to also free Indonesia from Dutch control. So the British were very hesitant to say, let's hold on to these places. They realized that it was going to be difficult. if the locals were to rise up, the British really weren't in a position to hold off any armed conflict. So they were keen to let go of these regions. They spoke to the locals. They came up with plans to say, okay, if you organize this, by this time, we're going to just give you independence. You can declare yourselves independent countries. And that was the plan that was going on in Malaya. And the Malay sultans, which were the hereditary rulers of Malaysia, they got together with the British. They came up with the idea of making Malaya at that time independent. And in 1957, the 31st of August, Malaya declared independence. So for the people of Singapore, it's quite interesting because you were looking up north and you realize that these people that were connected to you by history and by trade, etc., the British had given them independence. But the British held on to Singapore as a colony. And the people of Singapore like wondering, so when are you going to let us go? But Singapore wasn't the only place that was having this question. The British still held on to Brunei, which they held on to till 1972 actually. So not to be left out, the local elites in Singapore, led by our ever famous Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, streets born, Cambridge educated lawyer, he and his group of very well educated local elites led the push for independence, and they won the local elections, and they spoke to the British and say, right, if you're not going to give us independence outright, how about we join neighboring Malaya since we're so close? And you know, Singapore actually pulled a stunt by working also with independence forces in present-day Sarawak and Sabah, and say, if you take all these three territories, will you allow us, if we take a plebiscite, will you allow us to join Malaya as part of a new entity called Malaysia? So prior to 1963, Malaysia was actually just known as Malaya. The inclusion of the SIA at the end was a recognition of the entrance of Singapore into the Federation. So after the plebiscite in 1963, Singapore officially joined Malaysia as its 14th state. And you'll see this actual historical photo of Majula, Malaysia, Singapore joining Malaysia as a state with its while still retaining certain control over education, the police force, and housing. So till today, the history of the region is very interesting because if you were to fly to Sarawak or Sabah, they would have a separate immigration, even for Malaysians flying in from West Malaysia. So that's why Malaysia today as a country sits on two ends. They have an eastern part, they have a western part, all because of this history. And Singapore is actually part of it. But unfortunately, the idea fell through. As the story goes, in 1965, Singapore separated from Malaysia. The one end of the story is that Singapore was kicked out by the then Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tunku Abdul Rahman. You know, he played the gentleman's role. He said, Singapore doesn't fit, your politicians don't get along with us, you have a very different idea of what you want out of this whole independence thing. I suggest you leave. So basically, Singapore was kicked out. Whereas there is a revisionist view that felt that Singapore in the first onset was not going to fit. Singapore actually knew this whole being kicked out thing was the Tunku saying that he played a bad guy and then he take the rap for it. But in actual fact, Singapore itself didn't want to be part of the Federation anymore. But whatever is the real version, the ultimate reality was that in 1965, 9th of August, Singapore left the Federation. And on the right, you have that famous picture of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew shedding his tears on national TV, sharing with the people of Singapore at that time that, all right, we're no longer part of Malaysia, we're on our own. So being on our own basically meant that you didn't have access to the land, the resources of Malaysia. Singaporeans had to be suddenly, you know, fenced off. We had a separate passport. There was a question of how are you going to find employment for the people of this island. At that time, we had about somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million people, not very well educated, only had the port. not very well resourced either. So what was the plan then? How are we going to just get things going? So Singapore actually invited a World Bank advisor. They advised that if Singapore was to survive, we would need to go through rapid industrialization. Money was poured into, loans were taken, money was poured into building up factories, etc. Singapore put up very um, attractive tax breaks, etc., to encourage foreign corporations to invest in Singapore. And they did come. European companies like Philips, Japanese companies like Sony, they built their transistor radios, their televisions in Singapore. They came, they hired the locals, they trained locals, they effected a technology transfer. And all this was geared towards building Singapore up as an export-oriented economy where all the local production was sold to other parts of the world. And this plan worked. Basically, it brought in into Singapore massive foreign direct investment. It created jobs for the locals. And this also therefore meant that Singapore had to set up an education system that would produce workers for such an economy. So 57 years on, this is the fact of Singapore. 1965 per capita income $428. Today it's almost 180 times. Singapore's per capita income as of 2021 was 72,000, and all this is measured in USD. A very impressive track record for 57 years, something which many countries in Africa have tried to emulate. Singapore's success story is something which is nothing short of a miracle. Singapore managed to achieve first world status in a short span of just over 30 years. In 1965, Singapore was just a developing country. By the 1990s, Singapore had actually reached a developed country status. Yeah, so the running joke is that for most Singaporeans born during this period, we went from a third world country to a first world country without migrating. Whereas many parts of the world, people actually migrate just to get into a first world. We just sat here and then we became a first world country. So for myself personally, interesting event that happened was that when I was traveling in the US, I actually sat next to an American gentleman. I was telling him that when I was growing up, I didn't have running water, but today I'm living in a first world country. So that is the kind of transformation that many people, especially Americans, would probably not have experienced in their lifetime, because that has happened in America across a period of 200 years. Whereas for Singaporeans of my generation, it happened in just a short span of 30 years, practically my entire adult life. That's what has happened. Literacy rates, 1965, slightly over half of the population was literate. And when we say literacy at this point, it was literacy up to, let's say, a primary school level, and in diverse languages, not necessarily English. But by this year, actually, Singapore is near 100% literacy. Practically, if you're walking around in Singapore, everybody speaks English. We are pretty much a very globalized city now, and a lot of Singaporeans actually travel everywhere. And it's just very, very different as a country. So for people of my mother's generation, my father's generation, it is a different world out there. Sometimes it feels like they were plucked out of where they were born and moved to another country where nobody speaks the language that they spoke anymore, that they speak today anymore. Yeah. And in terms of military, Singapore went from a colony to an independent country, and in the region itself, Singapore today is ranked 29 out of 145 countries by military indexes. It spends $13.4 billion on military defense. Something very amazing that a relative of mine once mentioned is like, your country is so small and you spend that much money defending yourself. It's quite insane. Yeah. So Singapore's rapid changes. Population 1.65 million. Today we have 5.45 million. It is the second densest, second most populated, densely populated place in the world, just after Hong Kong. And even in terms of land mass, Singapore has also grown. surprising fact is that in the 1960s, Singapore only had a land mass of 500 over square kilometers. Today, it's 750 square kilometers. So just to put that in perspective for some of you, Singapore is actually only the 1/4 the size of Rhode Island. So it's not a very big place, but we've actually managed to grow our land mass by about 40%. Yeah. So you can see on the map here, the yellow parts are the original Singapore. All the gray parts are all reclaimed land. When you arrive in Singapore, you will arrive in our Changi International Airport, which is seated on the right-hand side of the screen, right on reclaimed land. The whole of our international airport sits on reclaimed land that was reclaimed more than 20 years ago. And most of our petrochemicals, our military training area, our port facilities are all sitting on reclaimed land itself. And on your last day in Singapore, when you visit the Gardens by the Bay, all that sits on reclaimed land as well. So this is Singapore's modern skyline that you will see for yourself when you get here. This is the part where earlier on my map showed the development of Singapore town. This is the modern night view of Singapore. On the right is the Singapore Flyer. In the middle is the Arts and Science Museum. And on the left is the iconic Marina Bay Sands Hotel, which is owned by the Sands Corporation from Las Vegas. It is one of 2 casinos in Singapore, and I don't know, I've heard that it costs a pretty penny to get a drink at the top of on the rooftop bar at the top. I myself have never been up there. I should, but yeah, I haven't got around to it. So I hope that you will enjoy the view when you get here. So a bit of a scorecard. Busiest port in Southeast Asia, second in the world. Best airport since time immemorial. I lost count. They've won it so many times that I don't even know when they first start winning it. Yeah, Changi Airport is one of its kind in the world. I've traveled to several airports in the world, and I hate to say this, but home is best. Yeah. Best healthcare in Asia. Also dubiously the most expensive city in the world. So be prepared. Things in Singapore can be very pricey. It's the 9th safest country in the world by statistics. Firearms are illegal. Generally in Singapore, you can walk on the streets at 4 AM in the morning like now, and you are perfectly safe. I can just walk across the street and pick up something from a convenience store. It's fine. You know, I can send my son out to go and grab it. It's fine. Yeah. It's the 2nd most powerful passport in the world, ranked right after the Japanese passport. Singaporeans basically can travel to all countries in the world without a visa, except for 9 countries. Some of them being like India, Nepal, Bhutan. Actually, Singapore's passport allows us access to North Korea. We can even fly into North Korea without a visa. Truths and fines. Singapore, don't try littering. Bins are everywhere. It's yeah, you get fined for littering. Chewing gum. If you have heard, Singapore does not allow chewing gum. When it says it's not allowed, means it's not, you can't sell it, but you can still chew it. If you happen to have some gum on yourself, don't feel worried. You're not going to get arrested for that. Yeah. Singapore is covered in closed circuit televisions. You can't get away with anything in Singapore. CCTVs are around every corner. They will track you down. And then internet is pervasive. 5G is already in deployment everywhere. So you don't have to worry about losing mobile reception in Singapore. Truth is that Singapore is one of the few countries left in the world that have capital punishment for drug trafficking. Anything above 1 gram, I think, of cocaine, you would get hanged for it. So drug possession is a serious crime. Singapore also canes people for crimes of a sexual nature, crimes of if you do robbery, you can get caned. It's a pretty brutal process. Cars here are very expensive. Just yesterday, I heard the certificate of entitlement. In Singapore, you need to bid for a certificate before you can actually buy a car. So a Toyota Prius in Singapore now would cost you somewhere close to about 150,000 US dollars. Yeah. And that's ownership for 10 years. So literally cars are very expensive in Singapore. You see them, a lot of them on the road, so big, but everyone's driving around a pretty penny. Yeah. Singapore basically operates 24 hours. So if you're in Singapore and you're still suffering from jet lag and you want to go out and grab a bike, you will find it anywhere. Public transport, just get into a cab, tell the cab driver, bring you to a spot where you can get some food at 3 a.m. in the morning. They will find you a place. Yeah. So this is another aerial shot of Singapore. I chose this shot because it shows a very nice background of Singapore Island itself. This is probably taken from the view of what is southwestern Singapore, and then it shows all the housing estates, public housing estates that we have in the background. You see a lot of high-rise buildings, a lot of high-rise flats. Singapore is not an earthquake-prone region, so that allows us to build high-rise buildings without any worry or any provision for earthquake. So you'll see a lot of high-rise buildings.